Today, I'm talking about why when I make these videos, I'm always wrong. I'm an avid podcast listener, and while I usually listen to news and politics podcasts or podcasts like Radiolab, which kind of falls under the category of infotainment, there is one podcast that I confess I do listen to sometimes. It's basically a conspiracy theory podcast, and while I don't really subscribe to any conspiracy theories, I do enjoy this podcast just because I like to hear some wacky shit sometimes. It's also pretty funny to hear two relatively smart dudes have to use every kind of absurd logic to rationalize some crazy ideas. And that's one of the things I'm trying to get at. These guys aren't stupid. They just have this narrative in their head of how the world works. Every action that happens in the world, whether it be news, politics, or sport, there must be a diabolical group of wealthy individuals and politicians pulling the strings behind the scenes. Korea beat Germany 2-0 in the World Cup. That must have been because the Korean economy was slowing down and Apple needed more output from the Samsung factories for memory for iPhones, so the elites had to rig the game so the Korean people would get a little boost. You see those little trails that follow behind jets in the sky? That's not just water, those are chemtrails and that they put out in the atmosphere to keep us all docile. The Sandy Hook school shootings that took place back in 2012, which killed 27 fucking kids, that was done so that the people would demand gun control in the US and then they could never revolt against the ultra-powerful elites who are really pulling all the strings. All of these conspiracies are pretty absurd for a number of reasons, but because I occasionally listen to this podcast, I could see how these two, as I said, not dumb guys, totally believe these things. And it's because they have a narrative of how the world works. And they can fit anything they see into that narrative. And sometimes, while making these videos, I too fall victim to my own narrative of how I think Korean society works. Generally, this is how I come up with my ideas. First, I see some difference between how things are done in America and how things are done in Korea. Usually these things are pretty objective, like in general Korean people eat more kimchi than Americans, or in general Americans don't care as much about education as Korean people, or Americans don't give a fuck about the rain as much as Korean people. I mean, I'm still pretty amazed at how little it can rain before Korean people start to whip out umbrellas, but I digress. Anyway, after that first step, I start to ask myself, why? For example, why is Korea so considerably safer than most places in America? I mean, really, there could be several reasons. It could be that the police in Korea are more strict. It could be that punishments for crimes are more severe, or it could be that Korean people are generally less aggressive than Americans. And this is exactly where I fall into this trap of putting all my answers to these questions into this narrative I have in my mind of how Korean people are. This is exactly where I start thinking like a conspiracy theorist. Now I'll say this, if I had to ask you, or if I could poll Korean people about why the crime rate is higher in America than Korea, and I put forth my theory that it's because Americans are more aggressive, I would bet a lot of Korean people would agree with me. It's not a crazy idea, and this is where I possibly falsely assert my narrative of the strict Korean school system as the answer. It's my understanding that although it's rapidly changing, in Korean schools, students are taught to be respectful and listen to their teachers without question, whereas in American schools, we're generally taught to be more forthcoming, more assertive, more questioning of authority, and as such, it may produce more aggressive people, which may lead to a higher crime rate. And even if this sounds good and reasonable, it isn't necessarily true. Many of the theories I posit in my videos sound good and reasonable, but they really aren't necessarily true. This is why I always ask for people to leave comments and try to have a discussion in the comments thread, because I may very well be wrong. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of factors that will determine the general crime rate of a country. It could be that Korea has a more homogeneous population, which leads to less friction amongst groups of people, which leads to a lower crime rate. It could be that America has guns, so if we aren't prepared to go through with some illegal activity, we'll be shot by someone else. There might even be some crazy correlation between obesity and high crime rates, which, because America is generally a more obese country than Korea, lead to a higher crime rate. Without some extensive sociological study, there's really no way of knowing which one, if any, of these things are true. In fact, my theory that there is a higher crime rate in America than in Korea because Korean students are taught to be more respectful and Americans are taught to be more assertive might be completely false. It could be that when kids are taught to be respectful, they repress their emotions, and then later in life they actually want to let loose those emotions, and they do it in the form of crime. And kids who have been taught to be more assertive growing up don't have these repressed emotions and thus have less of a desire to commit crimes. It could be that's not due to the Korean schooling system that Korea's crime rate is so low, but in fact, in spite of the Korean schooling system, that the crime rate is still somehow so low. So as you can see, the way I answer all of my curiosities about Korean culture through this narrative I have can often lead me to being very wrong. But sometimes it's good to be wrong. Have you ever been in an argument where the person you're arguing with brings up a really good point and you know they're wrong, but you have no response? Or even sometimes someone might casually insult you or a friend, and then you really wish you had the right thing to say, but you somehow can't think of it on the spot. Then when you're riding home on the bus, you think, damn, I should have said blah, blah, blah. I know this is super aggravating, but these moments prepare you for the next time it happens. The next time some dude says, I think the crime rate in Korea is so low thanks to our education system being so strict and forcing the students to be super respectful of their elders, you could say, fuck you, man. It's actually in spite of that kind of authoritarian respect forced on children that the crime rate is low, because I think when you repress children like that emotionally, it makes them more aggressive as adults and makes them want to commit crimes even more. Now, obviously, you probably don't yell at people in quite the same way I tend to, but you could see that now you are prepared to answer that question. Now you've had some time to prepare your thoughts on this issue, think about them, and really explain how you feel about why the crime rate in Korea is so low. So although it might be good sometimes, when I make these videos, I'm often very wrong.